Hello there and welcome to a new video for Age of Wonders 4, and in this one I got 10 tips and tricks for combat. Pretty basic ones. Those you can pick up even if you know almost nothing about the game, and they will still help you in achieving victory easier and understanding all those things better. So let's get started with a very basic one. And that's my number one. Let the enemies come towards you. Yeah, I know that sounds pretty basic, but there is almost never much to be gained to run into your enemies up front on the first turn. Unless you have some setup that really benefits from that. I know in this game you can mod up or tinker up pretty much anything, but your general approach, if you let them come, you can buff your troops with your supporters. If you can, in the next turn, you can buff your units with spells, and you can position your guys. There's so much that you can do by just sitting there, waiting. Your dudes all will go into defensive mode automatically. And here we have now, sure, the enemy does the same thing, and they are now in defensive modes, but we can now even click them here. And you see here, those sectors, they show how far the enemy will reach. We're just going to disengage here. Just like that. And now nobody of the enemy is able to get onto my troops anymore. Yes, they will be able to shoot out a few ranged attacks now, but we are able to slam out one of our empowering spells. My troops are well distributed around, and we can now, after the next turn, decide how we want to engage the enemy. This is not always ideal, but it is if you have really no idea how to get into a combat and no idea about the enemy, waiting it out and watching how the AI does its thing and getting on top of them out of that is usually quite a good way to get an entry into a fight. So, number two is regarding those defensive modes. As you see there's this blue quadrant around these guys. That's because this guy here is in a warding defensive mode. If you have units that can break this, like charging units, it's really cool. But if you don't worry too much. Having the ability to just unload all your units in one alpha strike is usually worth it, tanking through defensive modes for one first turn, usually. There's here now the ability for us to just go through the enemy like that. Because all of our units can now reach. We have melee units that can bind the enemy. We have ranged units that can all drop their attacks on top of the enemy. Therefore, this was just all by waiting. The enemy had no opportunity whatsoever to attack us, while we're taking all the advantages of the Alpha Strike. You can now top it off by supportive spells, defensive measures, like for example, we could now also set up our own priests in the back line to do the same trick as the enemy did. We can now cut off the enemy's pathways with our own troops. Either way, we are acting, not reacting, and that's pretty much where I wanted with number two. So number three regards a pretty much obvious thing, but I really want to stress it out. If you don't know what you're fighting against, check out your enemies and their skills. If you're just clearing out little map things here like I do, it's just a small scale fight, it is not that super important because most likely you're going to overrun your enemy anyways. But the larger the fight goes, the more important it is that you check out what's their traits, what's their specialties, what's their resistances. Are they vulnerable against anything? Are they specifically powerful in their resistances against anything? It's really worth knowing that, because sometimes you just end up sending your strongest attacker against something that's just the ideal counter to your guy, just because you didn't check out their traits or their resistances. And that would be quite sad, wouldn't it? And you can't just avert that by checking out the enemy. I don't do that for every encounter unless I'm really curious about the units, because it's actually quite fun to look at them. Their models are cute and all, but the stats are what counts. So number four is regarding something about your troop composition. You really are best off if you mix your damage types and your attack types quite fairly or thoroughly. What do I mean with that? You shouldn't end up with an army composed only of ranged units. You shouldn't end up with an army composed only of magic attackers, and so on and so forth. Diversity counts because this game is basically a glorified rock, scissors, papers game with a lot of extra things added, but at the end of the day, most units counter a certain type of unit. There's basically a trait for every strategy to counter it. There's unit types to counter a strategy. Therefore, all in all, you are best off if you are able to fire from different channels, and you can basically be sure that you're not going to get countered by just some traits of the enemy if you follow that. It's not that easy because every faction has their own mixture of attack types and damage types, but you'll be ending up with something if you keep these things in mind. So, number 5 is something quite easy to do and quite easy to understand. Try to keep your unit stacks alive. Try to avoid under any circumstances that they get completely destroyed, because you would lose that juicy XP. Experience points, they matter quite a lot. Not only do you get more HP up front, you also get those medals. Medals, well, the elite medal here does only apply more damage, but pretty much every unit has a pretty sick upgrade on their legend type. So these guys with the sprint, they can totally ignore enemies' zones of control. Every unit gets something different on their legend level, and it really pays off to let them survive that long. Therefore, really, if you have somebody being almost eradicated, you probably are best off by just paying attention and trying to heal them up and all those things. So, number 6 regards attacks of opportunity. So, you can easily avoid attacks of opportunity by just helping out your guys and killing off the unit that's threatening them currently. I mean, it's pretty much a no-brainer to not run away from these guys now, to avoid that free smack, but sometimes it just pays off to just do something like this. This is not a perfect example, but it's about the principle here. So I killed off this guy, and now my warriors can move again and go for an entirely different target. So you don't necessarily need to give the enemy the opportunity to whack you if you can just kill them before you move the threatened unit. These little things, they add up to damage mitigation. You just basically want to avoid as much damage as you can on your units. But yeah, I think that's pretty much a no-brainer at that point. So number 7 is regarding a attack order thing. You should always try to go for the guys first that deal the most damage, and for the guys last that are just resilient and don't do much damage. For example, these guys here are just a shield unit. Yes, they got mind controlled by the nymph now, but let's just ignore that for a moment. It's just smarter to kill that guy who has lower resistances, lower HP, and higher damage than this guy. And it's easy to be like caught in the heat of the moment and I want to finish off this guy before I get on over to the next guy, but sometimes it really pays off to let that tank live with 50% HP and focus on entirely other targets, because they are actually hurting your folks. These guys, most of the time their damage is quite neglectable, so you can do a lot of goodness by favoring your enemies in the correct order. So, number 8 is one big strategic thing, and here I got a perfect example for that. You always want to try to pick as many troops as you need to, but as few as possible. Basically, you want to try to cut down your army size as much as you can, but at the same time you want to be able to overrun your enemy safely still. This is really one of the more difficult things in the game to master, but in a nutshell, the game offers power numbers right next to each army. I can't show it here right now, but you can compare those numbers. So if your army is 500 and the enemy army is 500, the AI assumes you are even off, but you should always consider that you have access to spells and you have access to a human brain. Therefore, you usually are able to fight against some sort of advantage against the AI. And the better you know the game and your spells and your faction and your units, the more you can force a victory at that point. It's really something you have to learn by yourself, but it really pays off to just try to force your luck a little bit and try to go for a little bit more efficiency. This way you have more troops for other opportunities, conquering more parts of the world, conquering more enemies, defending your borders, whatnot. There's always something to do for more armies. Which brings me to number 9. We want to have not only one army, we want to have as many armies as possible. While your hero can only maintain 6 units, you can bring up many rosters of 6 units, and you can bring up more than just 6 units on one battlefield. Here I just had two guys standing right next to my main army on the map, and I brought them in. So all in all, in my opinion, it really pays off to have as many troops as possible as you can feasibly supply with your economy, because you know, there's always something to do for those guys. Either they accompany your hero or they defend your borders. I already mentioned it. Armies have always some sort of a purpose in this game, and therefore don't rely on only one big massive doom stack that's just rampaging through the lands. Prepare something to back up, to have a huge army when the AI comes, because it's basically impossible to win this game without the AI dogpiling on you at some point. You either conquer them or you defend against them, so you better be prepared with big armies. So don't rely on only 1 or 2 big armies. Have as many as possible of them, and just let them stand there and guard your premises. Now, and number 10, the last one, I want to talk about the casualty system in the game. So as you see here, every unit is comprised of a certain amount of guys. The more guys die in a unit, the lower the damage goes that they do with a single action. So far, so clear. But there's a lot of units in this game that are like mythological beasts that are just huge and massive, and their unit is just one single guy. If that's the case, they won't grow weaker. They will do exactly the same damage with just 10% HP, just like they have with 100% HP. So in a nutshell, if there's only one unit in the enemy unit, or one guy in the enemy unit, you have to kill them off entirely to make sure that you got rid of the threat. Whereas with troops that are composed out of many units, weakening them down to like 1, 2, or 3 guys really takes off their pressure already a lot. It's really important to know that the game works like that. Single units are just either kill them entirely off or don't touch them at all, because the result on the enemy turn will be exactly the same. Alright, that's 10 things that are really easy and basic. I'm already working on a more advanced list, so if you want to let me know what you thought about that, I'd be really appreciating. Leave me a thumbs up if you enjoyed. Consider subscribing. I'd be really appreciating that as well. And there is also a playlist link down there to all the other Age of Wonders things that I did so far. So, thanks for watching. See you soon.